The Starlight Motel sat like a forgotten relic along a decaying stretch of Route 66, where the American dream had long since moved to the interstate. Its neon sign flickered with epileptic rhythm. VA and Y, the C and second C, burned out years ago. Inside room 14, a man who had once carried 7 different passports now struggled to remember his real name. Thomas Caldwell. Or was it Tomasz Kowalski? Or perhaps Thomas Brennan? Sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, staring at the rotary phone as if it might ring with orders from Langley. It hadn't rung in 3 years. Not since the Berlin Wall fell. Not since the world he'd spent 30 years navigating simply ended. The room smelled of cigarette ash, instant coffee, and something else. The metallic tang of fear that never quite washes out, no matter how many cheap motel soaps you use. On the pressboard desk sat a portable typewriter, a half-empty bottle of Jim Beam, and 17 spiral notebooks filled with handwriting that shifted between 3 different styles. Sometimes he wrote in English, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in a cipher he'd invented in Prague in 1968 and could no longer decode. Outside, the desert wind pushed tumbleweeds against the chain-link fence. Inside, Caldwell's hands trembled as he lit another Marlboro. The tremor had started in Beirut in '83, after the embassy bombing. Or was it Warsaw in '76? Memory had become a traitor, more unreliable than any double agent he'd ever run. He opened notebook number 12 and read his own handwriting from 3 days ago. They're watching the parking lot. Silver Volvo. Change plates twice. KGB? Stasi? Or nothing at all. Caldwell walked to the window, parting the orange curtain with 2 fingers. The parking lot was empty except for his own rusted Ford Fairmont and a semi-truck whose driver was sleeping in the cab. No silver Volvo. There never was. But 2 nights ago, there had been. He'd written down the plate number, an M847 GDR. The GDR suffix had made his blood run cold. German Democratic Republic, East Germany, a country that no longer existed. He'd been trained at Camp Peary, the farm, in 1961, when Kennedy was still alive and the world still made sense. They'd taught him how to break a man's will without leaving marks, how to dead-drop microfilm in a hollowed-out boat, how to live for months as someone else. What they hadn't taught him was how to stop. The first deployment had been Berlin, 1962. He'd run assets out of a fake advertising firm near Checkpoint Charlie. The Cold War was frigid and clear then. You knew who the enemy was. They wore different uniforms, spoke with accents, drank different vodka. By 1968, he was in Prague during the Soviet invasion, photographing tank formations from a 4th-floor apartment while a collaborator named Mila fed him plum dumplings and lies in equal measure. Then came the dark years. The operations that didn't officially exist. Nicaragua, Angola, Afghanistan, where he'd funneled Stinger missiles to Mujahideen fighters who later became America's enemies. Somewhere in those decades, Thomas Caldwell had dissolved into his cover identities like sugar and acid. Now, in this roadside motel where truckers paid by the hour and prostitutes worked the night shift, he tried to reassemble the pieces. But the puzzle had too many edges and no corners. His psychiatrist at the VA hospital in Albuquerque, a kind woman named Dr. Chun who knew nothing about his real service record, had diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder with paranoid features. She prescribed Haldol and suggested group therapy with Vietnam veterans. Caldwell had attended once. When a Marine described nightmares about the Tet Offensive, Caldwell had nearly laughed. Nightmares had rules. You woke up from them. What he experienced was different. It was a collision of 30 years of compartmentalized lies erupting simultaneously. In his mind, operations overlapped like double-exposed photographs. He'd remember a dead drop in Budapest, then realize it might have been Bucharest, or both, or neither. He'd recall a source code named Redbird, then find 3 different descriptions of Redbird in his notebooks, each incompatible with the others. The worst part wasn't the confusion. It was the certainty that some of these memories had been intentionally altered, modified, erased and rewritten like a palimpsest by agency psychologists conducting experiments he consented to while under operational stress. or perhaps under chemical influence he couldn't remember consenting to at all. He'd been part of Culture's successor programs, though they'd called it something else by then. In 1977, stationed in Frankfurt, he'd volunteered for enhanced resistance training, a euphemism for letting agency doctors dose him with experimental compounds to test his resistance to Soviet interrogation drugs. He remembered signing papers. He remembered a clinical room. Then nothing. 3 weeks gone. When he returned to operations, his handler had smiled and said, "Welcome back, Thomas. Good to see you're still you." But was he? At 3:17 a.m., Caldwell jerked awake to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Measured, professional, not the stumbling gait of a drunk trucker or the quick click of a working girl's heels. These were tactical footsteps. Heel-toe, deliberate weight distribution. The kind taught at Fort Benning or the Balashikha train facility outside Moscow. He rolled off the bed, reaching instinctively for the Browning high power that had been confiscated by VA security in 1990. His hand closed on air. Instead, he grabbed the only weapon available, a heavy glass ashtray. The footsteps stopped outside room 14. Silence. Then a sound that stopped his heart. 3 soft knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. 3, 2, 1. The Prague signal. The one his handler had used in 1968 to indicate a compromised meeting site. A signal no one alive should remember or use. Caldwell pressed himself against the wall beside the door, ashtray raised. His breath came in shallow gasps. His mind raced through possibilities. Stasi sleeper agent, KGB revenge operation, or, worst of all, an agency cleanup crew sent to tie up loose ends now that the Cold War was over and men like him were liabilities. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. The footsteps retreated down the hallway. When he finally opened the door, the corridor was empty, but on the concrete walkway outside his room, someone had left a package wrapped in brown paper. No markings. No address. Just a package that shouldn't exist. Caldwell carried it inside with trembling hands, locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape marked only with a date. August 15th, 1976, Warsaw. August 15th, 1976. He'd been in Warsaw. He remembered that much. But doing what? For whom? The mission file had been sealed, even from him. Need-to-know compartmentalization. His controller had said. Now, 16 years later, someone wanted him to know. The Starlight Motel didn't have a tape player, but Caldwell did. A portable reel-to-reel he bought from a pawn shop, telling himself he'd use it to record his memoirs. He'd never recorded anything. Until now. He threaded the tape with the muscle memory of a man who'd done it 1,000 times in safe houses across Europe. His hand still knew the procedure, even if his mind had forgotten why. He pressed play. Static. Then voices. Speaking Polish. Then English. Then a voice he recognized because it was his own, but younger, harder. The voice of a man who hadn't yet started to break. Subject is responding to the compound. Pupils dilated. Elevated heart rate. Administering secondary dose. Another voice, American, clinical. "Thomas, can you hear me? I need you to describe what you see." His own voice slurred. "I see the room is, there are 2 of you." "No, 3. The walls are breathing." "Good. Now tell me about Operation Gatekeeper. Tell me what you remember about Prague." "Prague? I was there. 1968. The tanks. Mila. What did Mila tell you, Thomas?" She said the list was wrong. The names. They weren't all KGB. Some were ours. Some were. The tape went silent. Not the silence of a pause, but the silence of deliberate erasure. 30 seconds of magnetic void. Then his voice again, different now. Robotic. "I don't remember Prague. I was never in Prague." "Good. And Gatekeeper?" "There is no Gatekeeper. There never was." The tape ended. Caldwell sat in the darkness of room 14, the implications crystallizing with terrible clarity. They hadn't just run him as an agent. They'd run him as an experiment. They'd erased operations from his memory, installed false ones, turned him into a weapon who didn't even know what target he'd hit. And now someone who knew the old signals, who had access to sealed tapes, wanted him to remember. The question that kept him awake until dawn was simple and terrifying. Why now? And who wanted him to know the truth? The tape had unlocked something. Not clarity, never that, but a doorway to a past that felt both lived and implanted. Caldwell spent the next 72 hours in room 14, surviving on black coffee and Benzedrine tablets he'd saved from his operational days, trying to force his mind back to Warsaw, to 1976, to whatever Operation Gatekeeper had been. Memory returned in fragments, like shrapnel working its way to surface. He'd arrived in Warsaw in July 1976 under diplomatic cover, listed as a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy. His real purpose: run interference on a Soviet intelligence network that had penetrated NATO's nuclear command structure. The Cold War was at a delicate moment. Détente was dying. The Soviets were deploying SS-20 missiles. NATO was preparing Pershing IIs. One miscalculation could trigger the exchange both sides had nightmares about. Caldwell's contact was a Polish intelligence officer codenamed Redbird, Colonel Jerzy Kowalski of the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, Poland's secret police. Kowalski was a pragmatist, not an ideologue. He'd seen enough of Soviet occupation to understand that Poland was a hostage, not an ally. For 3 years, he'd been feeding the CIA information about Soviet military movements in exchange for hard currency and a promise of extraction if things went bad. The meetings happened in a Baroque church near the old town, always during confession. Caldwell would kneel in the booth, and Kowalski would whisper troop movements, missile deployments, KGB surveillance schedules through the wooden lattice. It was almost medieval, this exchange of secrets in a house of God. But it worked, until it didn't. On August 12, 1976, Kowalski had passed Caldwell a list. 18 names, typed on tissue paper thin enough to be swallowed if necessary. NATO moles, Kowalski had whispered. KGB penetration agents. High level. This goes to Langley immediately. And Thomas, be careful. Someone in your own service is on this list. Caldwell had photographed the list with a Minix camera concealed in a cigarette lighter, then burned the paper in the church's votive candles. That night, he transmitted the microfilm to Langley via diplomatic pouch. 3 days later, Kowalski was dead. Official report: heart attack. Caldwell knew better. Kowalski was 42, athletic, non-smoker. The KGB had a poison that mimicked cardiac arrest perfectly. No autopsy would detect it. And Caldwell had been pulled from Warsaw within hours, told the operation was compromised, told to forget everything. Need to know compartmentalization, they'd said, for your own protection. But now, listening to that tape in the Starlight Motel, he understood. They hadn't pulled him for his protection. They'd pulled him for theirs. Because someone in the CIA, someone with access to Caldwell's reports, had wanted that list buried. And the only way to bury it completely was to bury it in Caldwell's own mind. He opened notebook number 4 and found something he'd written 6 months ago, during a rare moment of lucidity. Mila warned me in Prague. She said, "The Americans and Soviets aren't enemies. They're partners in a game where everyone else is expendable. You think you're a player. Thomas, you're a piece." Mila, he hadn't thought about her in years. Or had he thought about nothing else? A Czech linguist who'd worked as a translator for the Soviet embassy in Prague. She'd been one of his sources during the '68 invasion. Young, brilliant, disillusioned with communism after watching Soviet tanks crush the Prague Spring. They'd been lovers. Briefly, intensely. In the desperate way people love when the world is ending. She disappeared in October 1968, right after Caldwell had been rotated back to Langley. He'd filed inquiries. Officially, she defected to West Germany. But he'd never been able to confirm it, never received any follow-up. It was as if she'd simply been erased from existence. Now, in the synthetic light of the motel room, Caldwell wondered, had Mila ever existed at all? Or was she another implanted memory? Another layer of operational cover, so deep even he couldn't distinguish truth from fiction? The phone rang. Caldwell stared at it. The rotary phone that hadn't rung in 3 years. At 2:34 a.m. on a Tuesday, he picked it up slowly. Thomas Caldwell? The voice was American. Male. 60s. Authoritative. Who is this? Someone who knows what gatekeeper really was. Someone who knows what they did to you in Frankfurt. You've been asking the wrong questions. Thomas. The tape was just the beginning. Where did you get that tape? I was there. August 1976. Warsaw Station. I helped carry you out after they dosed you. You don't remember me because they made sure you wouldn't. But I remember you. And I remember what we buried. Caldwell's throat tightened. The list. The 18 names. Kowalski's list. 13 of those names were KGB moles. Real penetrations. We rolled them up quietly over the next 2 years. But 5 names, those 5 were different. Different how? They weren't Soviet agents, Thomas. They were ours. CIA officers running a parallel operation completely off-book, skimming NATO nuclear intelligence to sell to third parties. Not the Soviets, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, anyone who'd pay. It was a rattling that went all the way to deputy director level. The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible. That would be treason? Yes, which is why everyone who knew about it had to be eliminated or neutralized. Kowalski was killed. The Warsaw Station chief had a convenient car accident in 1978. And you, they couldn't kill you. Too many people knew you, so they did something worse. They scrambled your memories so thoroughly that even you wouldn't know what you'd seen. Why are you telling me this now? Because one of those 5 names just became National Security Advisor, and he's about to declassify a tranche of Cold War documents to make himself look like a reformer. If those files go public without redaction, certain people will do anything to stop it, including tying up 30-year-old loose ends. Loose ends like me. You're not paranoid, Thomas. You're in danger. Real danger. The silver Volvo? That was a surveillance team. They're figuring out how much you remember. If you keep digging, they'll decide you remember too much. Then why tell me any of this? A long pause. Because you deserve to know the truth before the end. And because I'm dying, stage 4. I've got maybe 6 weeks. Someone should know what we did, what we became. The line went dead. Caldwell sat in the darkness. The receiver still pressed his ear, listening to dial tone like it was a message from the void. Everything he believed about his service, the moral clarity, the necessity, the sacrifice, had been built on a foundation of lies. He hadn't been defending America from Soviet aggression. He'd been a pawn in an internal CIA power struggle, a witness to treason who'd been neutralized more efficiently than any bullet could manage. They'd stolen his mind, given him back a version of himself that couldn't endanger them. A paranoid, broken man whose testimony would never stand up in any courtroom or congressional hearing. He walked to the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. 56 years old. Gray hair. Hollow eyes. The face of a stranger wearing his name. But beneath the damage, beneath the pharmaceutical fog and the psychological manipulation, something remained. A core of certainty. A trained instinct that recognized patterns even when conscious memory failed. He returned to the desk and began mapping everything he knew, everything he'd written in 17 notebooks, looking for pattern, names, dates, operations. The fragments began to align. 3 hours later, as dawn turned the desert outside from black to pink, he found it. In Notebook 7, written in his own hand 6 months ago, Frankfurt, 1977. Room 4B. Medical officer, Dr. Raymond Pierce. Said the treatment would help with PTSD. Said it was voluntary. But was it? Dr. Raymond Pierce. Caldwell grabbed Notebook 11, flipped through. There, a newspaper clipping from 1989. Dr. Pierce had died in a skiing accident in Colorado. But the obituary mentioned his previous work. Behavioral research consultant for government agencies, specializing in memory reconsolidation therapy. Memory reconsolidation. The process of accessing a memory and rewriting it during the brief window when it's unstable. The CIA had been experimenting with it since the late 60s, trying to create agents who couldn't be broken under interrogation because the memories themselves could be altered or deleted. They'd used Caldwell as a test subject, wiped Warsaw, rewrote Prague, maybe even invented Mila entirely to give him an emotional anchor in a false reality. But memory is stubborn. It leaves traces, like palimpsest parchment. You can scrape away the surface text, but the original words bleed through over time. Caldwell had been bleeding through for 3 years in this motel, and someone had noticed. The question now was, what would he do with the truth? He pulled out the Fairmont's keys and made a decision. If they wanted to silence him, they'd have to find him first. And Thomas Caldwell, whatever else they'd taken from him, still remembered how to disappear. Caldwell drove east through the night, leaving New Mexico behind. The Fairmont's engine knocked and wheezed, burning oil, its odometer registering 217,000 miles of hard American asphalt. He kept the state highways, avoiding interstates where surveillance cameras had multiplied since the Cold War's end. Old habits. The trade craft was still there, buried beneath confusion like bedrock beneath sand. He'd emptied his motel room completely, burning 13 of the 17 notebooks in a barrel behind the starlight before dawn. The remaining 4, the ones containing the clearest fragments, were wrapped in plastic in a hollowed-out spare tire. Before leaving, he'd made one call from a payphone outside a truck stop, the Albuquerque VA, leaving a message for Dr. Chun that he was discontinuing treatment. She'd try to follow up. She wouldn't find him. The anonymous caller had given him a single concrete lead, Frankfurt, Dr. Raymond Pierce, the man who'd administered the memory treatments in 1977. Pierce was dead, but his work wasn't. Somewhere in the CIA's vast bureaucratic machinery, there would be records, project files, medical documentation. The agency kept everything. It was both their strength and weakness. Even illegal programs left paper trails if you knew where to look. Caldwell's destination was Washington, D.C., but he wasn't going to Langley. He was going to see the one man who might have the access he needed. Marcus Webb, a former director of operations officer who'd retired in 1987 and now taught Cold War history at Georgetown. They'd worked together briefly in Berlin in the early 70s. Webb was honest, a rarity in the intelligence world, and if anyone could help navigate the classified archives, it would be him. The drive took 4 days. Caldwell slept in the car at rest stops, eating gas station sandwiches, constantly checking his mirrors for surveillance. In Oklahoma City, he thought he spotted the silver Volvo 3 cars back on I-40. His heart had accelerated, hands tightening on the wheel. But when he'd exited abruptly and circled back through surface streets, the Volvo hadn't followed. Probably just paranoia. Probably. By the time he reached the capital, spring was beginning to assert itself. Cherry blossoms budded along the Potomac. The city looked peaceful, innocent, nothing like the nexus of global power and secrecy it actually was. He found Webb's house in Georgetown, a narrow townhouse with ivy climbing the brick facade. When Webb answered the door, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to concern in rapid succession. Jesus Christ. Tom Caldwell? You look like hell. I need your help, Marcus. Webb glanced past him at the street, then pulled him inside quickly. How did you find me? Phone book. You're not exactly hiding. That's because I'm not carrying secrets that could get me killed. Webb led him to a book-lined study. I heard you had problems after the wall came down. They scrambled my memory, Marcus. Frankfurt, 77. A doctor named Pierce. I need to see the files. Webb's face went carefully neutral, the expression of a man who's just heard something he suspected but hoped wasn't true. Tom, even if what you're saying is accurate, those files will be sealed, classified beyond what I can access. I'm retired, but you still have contacts, people at the archives, people who owe you. What makes you think there even are files? Caldwell pulled out Notebook 16 and flipped to a page of cramped handwriting. Because I've been writing down everything I remember for 3 years, and the patterns are there. Project Artichoke, Cultra, the behavioral modification programs. They didn't stop in 73 when the Senate held hearings. They just changed names, went deeper. I was part of the next phase. Webb poured 2 whiskeys without asking, handed one to Caldwell. All right, let's say you're right. Let's say they did conduct unauthorized memory modification on active officers. Why come forward now? Why not just let it go? Live quietly. Because someone from the program is about to become National Security Advisor. Because he's planning to declassify documents. And because there are people who kill to keep certain operations buried. Operations I witnessed but can't fully remember. What operations? NATO moles. Not Soviet, American. A CIA ring selling nuclear intelligence to third parties. I had their names in Warsaw in 76. 18 names on a list. They erased my memory of 5 of them. Webb was silent for a long time, staring into his whiskey. Finally, there's a person at the National Archives. She specializes in Cold War declassification requests. If anyone can access sealed medical files from that era, it's her. But Tom, if you're right, and someone is trying to bury this, going after those files will paint a target on your back. I've been a target since 1976. I just didn't know it. The National Archives building stood like a Greek temple on Constitution Avenue, housing the nation's memory in climate control vaults. Caldwell met Webb there 3 days later. Webb introduced him to Dr. Sarah Kincaid, a research archivist in her 40s with the tired eyes of someone who'd spent too many years reading redacted documents. Dr. Kincaid has agreed to help, Webb said carefully, but this stays off record. No official requests. No paper trail. Kincaid led them to a secure reading room in the basement, surrounded by bankers' boxes containing declassified CIA files from the 70s. What exactly are we looking for? Medical files. Behavioral Research Division. Specifically anything involving Dr. Raymond Pierce, Frankfurt Station, 1977. She worked in silence for 2 hours, pulling archive documents, cross-referencing catalog numbers. Caldwell watched her work, feeling the weight of decades pressing down. This was what his life had become. Sitting in a basement, searching for proof that his own mind had been stolen. Finally, Kincaid emerged with a single manila folder, marked with classification stamps that had been partially redacted. This was filed under a completely different program name, Project Bluebird, officially discontinued in 1975, but the dates on these medical requisitions are 1977 to 78. Caldwell opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were medical intake forms, consent documents, his signature, but he didn't remember signing, and clinical notes in cramped medical handwriting. Dr. Pierce's notes. Subject, Thomas Caldwell, DO/Euro. Voluntary participant in memory stabilization protocol following Warsaw incident. Subject experienced severe psychological trauma after asset termination. Exhibiting paranoid ideation internal security threats. Treatment plan. Sodium pentothal interviews to access traumatic memories, followed by reconsolidation therapy using experimental compound RP-77. Goal: reduce operational security risk while maintaining subject utility in field operations. Caldwell's hands shook as he turned pages. Each document was a piece of his stolen past. Session 4, August 15, 1976. Subject: access memories of Warsaw List. Significant operational security concern. Subject has knowledge of 5 compromised personnel in senior positions. Following consultation with DDO, decision made to suppress these specific memories while preserving operational skills and cover identity. RP-77 administered at elevated dosage. There it was, documented proof. They deliberately erased his knowledge of the 5 American traitors because those traitors were too valuable or too highly placed to expose. The final page made his blood run cold. Long-term prognosis. Subject will likely experience significant psychological deterioration over 10 to 15 years as suppressed memories attempt to resurface. Recommend monitoring and possible retirement to controlled environment if symptoms become acute. Alternative option: permanent termination if subject becomes security liability. They knew, Caldwell whispered. They knew this would destroy me eventually. They did it anyway. Kincaid was reading over his shoulder. There are names here. The 5 individuals whose identities were suppressed. The redactions are imperfect. I can partially read 2 of them. She pulled out a magnifying glass, examined the crossed-out text. This one looks like Brennan. And this, Ashford, are... Webb went pale. Robert Ashford? You know him? Caldwell asked. He's the incoming National Security Advisor, the one about to declassify the Cold War files. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Ashford was one of the 5, one of the CIA officers who'd been selling NATO nuclear intelligence. He'd spent 30 years climbing the ranks, his betrayal protected by the same system that had scrambled Caldwell's memory. And now Ashford was in a position to control the narrative, to declassify documents selectively, to bury his crimes under a mountain of carefully curated transparency. He knows you're a threat, Webb said quietly. If you started remembering, if you found these files... Tom, you need to disappear. Properly. Out of the country. No. Caldwell's voice was steady for the first time in years. I've been running from my own mind for 3 decades. I'm done running. Then what? Caldwell looked at the document spread before him. The evidence of institutional betrayal, of a system that sacrificed its own people to protect its secrets. I'm going to remember. All of it, whatever it takes. And then I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did. Kincaid closed the folder carefully. These documents can't leave this building. They're still technically classified. If you try to copy them... I don't need copies, Caldwell said. I just needed confirmation that I wasn't insane, that it really happened. But as they left the archives, Caldwell slipped one document inside his jacket. The clinical note with the partially visible names. It was theft of classified materials, a felony, but after what they'd done to him, he figured the government owed him at least that much. That night, in a cheap D.C. motel, Caldwell dreamed without medication for the first time in months. He dreamed of Warsaw, of Kowalski whispering through the confession screen, of the list, and for the first time he dreamed the 5 names clearly, written in Kowalski's precise typewriter script. Brennan, T. Ashford, R. Pierce, R. Morrison, J. Caldwell, T. He woke with a gasp, the final piece clicking into place. His own name had been on the list, not as a mole, but as a witness, as the officer who'd received the list, the officer who had to be neutralized. They hadn't erased Warsaw to protect the 5 traitors. They'd erased Warsaw to erase him. The realization should have broken him completely. Instead, it brought a strange clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand the shape of your cage. Caldwell sat in the D.C. motel room as dawn light crept through thin curtains, the stolen document on the bed beside him. His own name, typed in Kowalski's dead hand 36 years ago, marked him for elimination or neutralization. Not because he was a traitor, but because he'd seen the truth. The conspiracy wasn't vast. It didn't need to be. 5 CIA officers, strategically placed in European operations, skimming NATO nuclear intelligence and selling it to third parties for decades. Not ideological traitors, just profiteers. They'd made millions while playing both sides of the Cold War, secure in the knowledge that exposing them would damage American intelligence credibility beyond repair. Kowalski had discovered them through Polish intelligence intercepts. He'd given the list to Caldwell believing the CIA would clean house. Instead, the CIA had cleaned Caldwell's memory. Dr. Pierce, one of 5, had personally administered the treatments. No wonder he'd been so thorough. He'd been protecting himself. Now, with the Cold War over and files being declassified, Robert Ashford, another of the 5, had positioned himself to control the narrative. As National Security Advisor, he could ensure certain documents never saw sunlight, could bury the evidence forever, unless Caldwell stopped him. But how? He was a broken man with scrambled memories, living in motels, his testimony worthless in any official setting. The documents he'd stolen would be inadmissible, classified material obtained illegally. Even if he went to the press, Ashford had the power to brand him a delusional veteran, a victim of Cold War stress. The system would protect itself. Caldwell pulled out his last remaining notebook and began to write, not the fractured entries of the past 3 years, but something focused, deliberate, a complete account of Warsaw, Frankfurt, the list, the cover-up. He wrote for 6 hours straight, filling 50 pages with everything he could remember, everything he'd documented, everything he'd pieced together. When he finished, he made copies at a Kinko's, using cash. 3 copies. One would go to Webb with instructions to publish if anything happened to Caldwell. One would go to a reporter at the Washington Post who'd covered Iran-Contra and understood intelligence community corruption. The third would go directly to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He was signing his own death warrant. He knew that, but at least it would be his choice. Before he could mail the packages, his motel room phone rang. He'd checked in under a false name, paid cash. No one should have this number. He picked up. Tom. The voice was familiar. Robert Ashford. We need to talk. Caldwell's grip tightened on the receiver. How did you find me? The archives triggered an alert when your name appeared in a search query. Dr. Kincaid is a professional, but she has reporting requirements. I know what you found. I know what you think you remember. I remember Warsaw. I remember the list. I remember my own name on it. A pause. Then you remember wrong. Your name was on that list as a receiving officer, not as a subject. You were never a target, Tom. You were a victim of circumstance. Circumstance? You erased my memory to cover up treason. We suppress a traumatic memory to prevent a valuable officer from having a complete psychological breakdown. What happened to you was regrettable, but necessary. The 5 names on that list were part of a sanctioned operation you didn't have clearance to know about. Selling nuclear secrets to the Chinese is sanctioned? Nothing was sold. Intelligence was strategically shared to maintain global balance during a very unstable period. You're thinking like a field officer, Tom. At the strategic level, the picture was more complex. Caldwell laughed bitterly. Is that the story you'll tell when the documents are declassified? The documents that matter won't be declassified, but I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to help. You're sick, Tom. The treatments damaged you. I won't deny that, but we can fix it. Modern therapy, real treatment, a comfortable retirement with full benefits, medical care. You've served your country for 30 years. Let us take care of you. In a controlled environment, like Pierce recommended. A hospital, Tom, not a prison. You'd be safe, comfortable. No more confusion, no more paranoia. We can stabilize your memories properly this time. You could actually heal. Caldwell looked at the packages on the motel desk, ready to mail. And the people you betrayed? Kowalski? Webb's colleagues who had convenient accidents? Do they get to heal? Kowalski was KGB. He was feeding you disinformation. The list was partially fabricated to create exactly this kind of internal discord. You were used, Tom, by the Soviets. We were trying to protect you from that realization. It was a masterful lie, plausible, backed by institutional authority. If Caldwell hadn't spent 3 years piecing together his fractured memories, he might have believed it. I'm not taking your deal, Caldwell said. Then you're choosing a very difficult path. Without proof, you're just another disturbed veteran. The media won't believe you. Congress won't investigate. You'll die alone, convinced of conspiracies that exist only in your damaged mind. Maybe, but at least I'll die knowing the truth. Will you? Can you honestly tell me you trust your own memories anymore? We altered them once. How do you know we didn't alter them again? How do you know this conversation is even real? The question hit like a physical blow. Caldwell looked around the motel room. The peeling wallpaper, the flickering lamp, the documents spread on the bed. How did he know? What if this entire investigation was another implanted memory? Another layer of control? No, he couldn't afford that doubt. If he started questioning everything, he'd disappear into paranoid recursion. He had to trust something. He chose to trust the evidence. The documents. The pattern. I know because you're scared, Caldwell said. If none of this was real, you wouldn't be calling. Ashford's voice hardened. Last chance, Tom. Walk away. Or what? You'll kill me? I'm already dead. You killed Thomas Caldwell in Frankfurt in 1977. I'm just the ghost walking around in his body. He hung up. For several minutes, Caldwell sat in silence, adrenaline shaking through him. Then he grabbed the packages and left the motel, driving to 3 different post offices to mail them. No return address. Time-stamped and documented. The truth was out. Whatever happened now, he'd done what he could. He drove back to the motel expecting surveillance teams, arrest, or worse. Instead, he found his room undisturbed. He lay on the bed fully clothed, Browning high power in his hand. He'd bought it from a pawn shop that morning. No background check, no paperwork. If they came for him, he wouldn't go quietly. But they didn't come. Not that night. Not the next day. A week passed. Then, too, Caldwell moved between cheap motels, always paying cash, always checking mirrors. He watched the news obsessively. Nothing about Ashford. Nothing about declassification. Nothing about CIA scandals. Then, on April 28, 1992, a small article appeared in the Washington Post, buried on page A17. Senate committee requests CIA records review following anonymous tip. The article was brief. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence had received documentation suggesting irregularities in Cold War-era behavioral research programs. They were requesting internal CIA review of projects Bluebird, Artichoke, and related activities from 1975 to 1980. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close. But it was a crack in the wall. 3 days later, Robert Ashford withdrew his name from consideration as National Security Advisor, citing health concerns. Caldwell read the announcement in a diner outside Richmond, Virginia, drinking bad coffee and eating eggs that tasted like cardboard. He felt no triumph, no vindication, just exhaustion. The system would survive. It always did. There might be hearings, carefully worded apologies, symbolic reforms. But the fundamental structure, the one that allowed men like Ashford to flourish, would remain intact. He'd wounded it, though. That was something. That night, Caldwell checked into a motel along Route 66. Not the Starlight, but a similar relic 20 miles west. He opened the last notebook, the one he'd been writing this entire time, documenting everything. On the final page, he wrote, "I don't know how much of my memory is real anymore. I don't know if the truth I've uncovered is complete or just another layer of deception. But I know this. They took my mind, my identity, my life. They turned me into a weapon against myself. If someone reads this, if these notebooks survive, know that the Cold War didn't end in 1991. It just went underground, into the minds and files of people who'd rather burn truth than expose their crimes. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I was a CIA officer. I served for 30 years. And I died in Frankfurt in 1977. Everything since has been epilogue." He closed a notebook and placed it in a safety deposit box at a local bank, along with copies of all the documents. The key went into an envelope addressed to Marcus Webb, with instructions to open it only if Caldwell didn't make contact within 6 months. Then he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He took his medication. All of it. The Haldol, the lithium, the benzodiazepines Dr. Chun had prescribed. He swallowed pills until the bottles were empty. Not to die. To sleep. He was so tired of remembering. So tired of not knowing what was real. Maybe the drugs would bring the fog back. Maybe they'd blur the edges enough that he could live with the contradictions. Maybe he could find some peace in the space between truth and madness. As consciousness faded, his last thought was of Mila. Whether real or implanted, whether alive or dead, she'd been right about one thing. In the game between empires, people like them were never players. They were pieces, and pieces got sacrificed